Welcome to Norse Code, the number one podcast for you Minnesota Vikings. I am your host and producer. My name is James Pagashnik. Thank you guys so much for listening. And at the other end of the tin cannon string, we have our analyst and co-host. You know him from numerous blogs and podcasts around the internet, most notably from theathletic.com. He is Mr. Useful Human, Arif Hassan. Arif, how are you doing this afternoon?
Well, I remember my weekend, so I guess worse than the winners of Van Halen's Lost Weekend in 1984.
Right before we came on air, it was announced that Eddie Van Halen had passed away, and for whatever reason, and my initial reaction wasn't, that's too bad. My initial reaction was, how the hell did he outlive Dave? How the hell did he outlive Diamond Dave? I still don't understand it. But then it led us down the path of the MTV Lost Weekend contest of 1984, where the winner spent a weekend with Van Halen in Detroit. And that has, I know more about that than the game at this point. We watched the video for the we watched the video that aired for the spot for the contest, which MTV got like over 1 million people tried to win this thing. But there are several articles based on the winners trying to figure out, so what like 11-year-old won this? Like, what 7-year-old went out and experienced the excess of Van Halen? So that's it is too bad about his death. But for whatever reason, that was the first thing that came to mind. Is, oh, hey, do you remember this? This was a thing. This ended poorly for some schmuck. All right, let's welcome you, the listener, to this episode of Norse Code. Hope you are doing well. The Vikings won. That sound of surprise in my voice, I feel, is warranted, but the Vikings were able to defeat the Texans this last weekend, and apologies for the delay in the game. It went a little bit later. Monday night went a lot later than expected due to the COVID rescheduling, and so we decided just to knock this out on Tuesday afternoon for you. So again, thank you guys so much for listening, for sharing Norse Code links on social media, for telling people about it, for donating to the show. If you would like to donate to the show, if you hear value in what we produce, you can go to patreon.com/norsecode and access bonus material that we post about every week there. I think this week's episode is going to get posted on Thursday just so we can knock this out really quick. So we're going to have that bonus episode for you on Thursday. Also, you can go to paypal.me/norsecode as well, and you can just donate any amount that you would like there. Patreon is more of a subscription based product, so you end up doing about the same amount every month. So if you are interested in such a thing, Tree Fitty, to help keep Loch Ness Monster at bay, patreon.com/norsecode. Let's just get right into this. Let's just get right into the broadcast and talk about the victory over the Texans game. And what I want to ask first is this: what Bill O'Brien was fired after the Vikings defeated the Texans this weekend. Was this a game where the Vikings offense was able to shine, or was this a game where it was clear that whatever Bill O'Brien was throwing out was the opposite of what they should be doing?
I think it's a little bit of both. So, for example, I think one really good instance of the Vikings just playing really well is Justin Jefferson. Obviously, I just wrote a piece on Jefferson. We'll talk about more because we've got some questions about him in the mailbag. So that's a good opportunity to talk about it in more detail. But he was able to perform, I think, in a way that I think is just independently good evidence that he was a good player in the game, right? I thought the ball placement by Kirk Cousins on those throws to Jefferson was really excellent. I thought his usage of Adam Thielen, which has been kind of weird, right? Because mostly it's just been kind of opening drives for him. I thought that was pretty good in the game. And I think that is evidence of, the Vikings playing well, right? But there are other instances where it felt like, the Texans, probably could have done a little bit more from a game plan perspective to take on the Vikings. So I think like the usage, for example, of JJ Watt. So one thing that we brought up in the interview with Aaron Reese, last week in the preview of the game, was that it would make a lot of sense for Watt to kind of line up on the inside a lot and take advantage of the fact that he's been an interior rusher a lot, and his experience there has been like pretty important to like the way he's developed as a pass rusher. I mean, it's like just a big part of who J.J. Watt is. And you take a look at his snaps by position in the game, and he ended up taking 25 snaps at left end and another 14 at like Leo, which is left end outside. And then another 16 snaps right end or right end outside, and another snap or two at outside linebacker. His snaps at like defensive tackle, he only had 2. Now, sometimes your end snaps are going to be up against a guard just because of the way you're slanting, or because you've got a linebacker to the outside of you, and that's going to help you out and stuff like that. So that's not like definitive. You didn't only have 2 reps against, someone like Drew Samia, but it really feels like that was a huge opportunity for the Texans that they really didn't take advantage of, given Watt's skill set and his capabilities. So that, I think, is a really good example of where the Texans, I think, probably just played it wrong based off of the matchups. So that's part of it. The Texans did not seem particularly inspired to play for Bill O'Brien's job. I'm sure that played a role, right? Play this or I get fired. Like, oh, well, I mean, I thought you were here to motivate us, that sort of thing. So I think that was a big part of it. I think on the other side of the ball, you take a look at what the Texans were able to do, and you want to say, well, hey, look, the Vikings have had just this awful luck with the deep ball, right? And they throw like 4 passes over 20 yards, I want to say, 1 each to like Will Fuller, Jordan Akins, Kenny Stills, and Randall Cobb, and that's not how you use Will Fuller, first of all. But second, if you can't take advantage of how poor the Vikings secondary is, you're just not game planning well. Brandon Cooks ended up with 0 receptions in the game. Some of that has to do with Deshaun Watson being a little bit inaccurate, but some of that just has to do with like usage. Like, that the Vikings are down at cornerback. You know that their top 2 corners aren't going to be in the game, or top 3, right? Because Cameron Dancer's the best one. Chris Boyd is out. So like, you don't have who you need to have, and there's some potential injuries. It got so bad that George Aloka had to play nickel, and then Harrison Smith goes out, and so that opens up even other more opportunities for the deep ball, because now Aloka is playing Harrison Smith, and there's a discussion to be had about how much Harrison Smith versus George Aloka played a role in the receptions that they gave up. But I think that that's something that you target relentlessly if you're the Texans, especially if you're going to hold on to the ball forever anyway. So yeah, I think there were some problems with the Texans, but I thought, that there were a bunch of really good performances that needed to come from the Vikings. So obviously, like I said, Adam Thielen and Will Fuller played well defensively. You end up with a pretty decent performance from Jeff Gladney, who gave up 1 big play, and then after that, not much more. Sorry, I said the Cameron Dancer was out. He's not, but Chris Boyd was out, and Mike Hughes is out. It's so hard to keep track of all the cornerbacks. Cameron Dantzler, PFF charges him with the 24-yard reception to Will Fuller, which I think is appropriate, but there's a good debate to be had about that. Some people think it's on George Aloka. I really don't. But other than that, only gave up 15 yards in coverage. Holton Hill had a really wonderful game, only gave up 10 yards in coverage. Wonderful game from a coverage perspective. I think that you ended up with some really good performances. I think Eric Hendricks, I think this is the first game this year that he's played really well. He had just this remarkable leaping pass deflection that is one of the reasons Brandon Cooks didn't have a reception. And then Cooks had another drop too. So it wasn't like it was all Deshaun Watson. But I thought individually there was some pretty good play from the players on the offense and the defense. Now, obviously, they played against an 0-3 team, right? Like,
they played against an 0-3 team that people were saying is much better than their record, and it turns out they were wrong.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I think like part of it is just, it's kind of like how when a quarterback doesn't have any help, that's the first thing fans go to when you say that quarterback is bad. Like, Josh Rosen is bad. No, he doesn't have any help. And I'll be honest, I was kind of on that train too, that we needed a better environment for him, or Sam Darnold's bad. Oh, he doesn't have any help. Those things can be true, but also the quarterback is bad. And I think here with the Texans, it's, hey, the Texans have only played teams that are either undefeated or have only lost to each other. So they've played against the top teams in the AFC. They could actually be secretly good. And, the argument in response is, well, they probably would have played better in those games then, which is what Aaron said when we interviewed him. I asked him, like, hey, is this a thing? Like, their strength of schedule is the worst in the NFL, or the most difficult, I should say, in the NFL so far. and they're 0-3 against, teams that we would expect to win against, average teams, or the Texans secretly average. And he was like, no, let's get rid of that. And that's exactly what we saw.
There were people who had said that his preview of the game was about as accurate as we've ever had on the show. So I did enjoy how the end of the game did feel a bit like the Bomani and Jones video where they're asking, hey, is this guy still in the league? The end of Texans games tend to be that sort of thing. Like, oh, Randall Cobb is still in the league. All right. How is that a thing? Good for him. I didn't know that he was still around. Jeez.
Oh, Darren Fells. I remember when he was on the Cardinals.
Yeah,
wow.
That was another. It was like right in a row too. It's like, how is that? Are you just like breaking out players from the 2020 or from the 2012 version of Madden now? Like, what are you doing? Peyton Hillis is going to come out as a running back coach. It's going to be crazy. So let's talk about the Vikings offense specifically. Let's talk about Jefferson, because there were a couple of plays that he ended up making where you just sat back and went, I don't know how the hell you just did that.
Yeah. So Jefferson ends up with 4 targets, 4 receptions, 4 first downs, all of them over 20 yards, which is just kind of remarkable. And they each occurred in a different quarter, right? Quarter 1, 2, 3, 4. So it was just like kind of this nice, you could pace the game by Justin Jefferson, 20-yard receptions. And I think 2 of them came against Vernon Hargraves. One came against Bradley Roby. And the other, I'm checking PFF real quick, came against Phillip Gaines, who is a cornerback, I'm told. No, I remember him from the draft. Same draft as like EJ Gaines. It was very confusing. But yeah, he had 2 catches that I thought were really spectacular in terms of what he did at the catch point. I thought all of his catches were really just, I think excellent at some point in the process, either a release or on the route or something. But the final 2 catches, the third and fourth quarter catches, involved winning a contested catch that I wouldn't say saved an interception in the same way that like Stephon Diggs's, to use the player he's always going to be compared to. Stephon Diggs's really excellent catch at the end of the Bills game was like with that. Fundamentally, if he doesn't win that contested catch, that's a pick. That's not really what Jefferson did in the third quarter on his catch, but I thought it showed really excellent ball awareness. I thought it showed great adjustment to the ball, and it's the kind of thing that we knew he was good at. And so it was nice to see it kind of confirmed at the NFL level against NFL level players, if that's what you consider the Texans to be. But I thought the back shoulder throw, which a lot of people are talking about, and I think rightly so, was more impressive, right? That wasn't a contested catch, but those throws are really difficult. So he turns around a little bit early. Obviously he and Cousins haven't like developed the chemistry that like Jordy Nelson and Aaron Rodgers had on that throw, where, both of them just kind of have in mind when exactly it was going to be. So he turns around a little bit early, but, he looks the ball in and he does a really great job shielding the catch with his body and preventing the cornerback from getting access to the real estate that the ball is going to be in, which is a really difficult catch technique to learn. And it's something that I think Sterling Sharp made that really popular, using your body as a way to make sure that you're the only one with access to the ball. That's been a technique for years, but it's something that receivers need to learn more and more as they hit higher levels of play and contested catches become more likely. He did a great job of that with the back shoulder catch, and then kind of just an adjustment to a ball that's just kind of at an unnatural catching angle, but is exclusively for you and headed towards the sideline. That was really great to see, and it was like another deep throw, right? So really good to see Justin Jefferson play like that, because it provides some level of confirmation about what he was able to do in the previous game. So one of the things in my piece that I went over with Justin Jefferson is, hey, over the last 10 years, only one player's had more receiving yards over their first 4 games where they were active. It just so happens to be Stephon Diggs, which is very like weird and eerie. But you go over the past 30 years, and there's only one other additional player on top of that, Anquan Boldin in 2003, which I think, if people were watching football then, they all kind of remember his first couple of games where he got like 200 yards receiving and stuff like that. Really incredible stuff. And if Jefferson turns out to be Anquan Boldin, I think that would be fine. Obviously, you invest a first round pick, you want maybe a little bit more than that, but he's had a long, really productive, great career. I don't think he made any Pro Bowls, but there's a reason that every contested catch receiver that's like kind of good in college gets compared to Anquan Boldin. He's really like easy to remember, and he's a really good receiver, and he's good to have on a roster for a very long period of time, and it's replicable what he does. But yeah, I guess you could see it as maybe kind of a disappointment after that. But you take a look at kind of the rest of the receivers on that list, and receiver after receiver, are really high level players. Like Andre Johnson's on that list, Julio Jones is on that list, Calvin Ridley is on that list. I think no, Calvin Ridley might not be, but there's some pretty excellent players that ended up on that list of having over 300 yards in the first 4 games, and only one of them's a real disappointment, I think, with Kelvin Benjamin. Martavis Bryant's also a bit of a disappointment, and then Will Fuller, is kind of boom or bust. So, but another thing to look at with some of these players that didn't end up panning out is that they either had injury or off-field problems impact them. So there were 2 players in the 2000s where that's the case, and they only had one 100-yard game. So everybody with 2 100-yard games in those first 4 games, and it's a small sample, but it's good to get comparisons, ended up panning out in one way or the other in a pretty big way. So Deshaun Jackson's on that list too. So that is really, excellent to see, I think. That confirmation, relatively speaking, I think tells us that it's not a Tajay Sharp situation, right? Where he went off for like 100 plus yards against the Vikings and was just kind of quiet for the rest of the year and then ended up getting benched. No, it's a situation where, you want to keep getting this guy the ball. And it's not just because he's winning one matchup in one particular way, like Tajay Sharp did against Trey Waynes. It's that he's continuing to find ways to win. So, right now he's leading rookie receivers, which I did not anticipate when I called this a potential loss in terms of a trade for Stephon Diggs with the Vikings. But if he ends up being the best rookie receiver, or at least the most productive rookie receiver, obviously that puts you in a scenario where you can more, I think, credibly ask the question about whether or not the Vikings really substantially downgraded from Diggs. So fantastic. And that's the conversation we're at right now, which I think is really fun. Like, wow, could he actually do it? And I think right now the evidence suggests, right, that he can. We have to take our priors into account, which is that he's a rookie and that he didn't have a ton of production, even in his limited opportunities in the first 2 games, and that's part of the sample too. So we have to take all that into account. We know that rookies, will have swells and sometimes will fall off after hot starts, and actually Greg Jennings is a really good example of that. Stephon Diggs himself is a really good example of that, where after really strong starts to the rookie year, they kind of just fell off and they weren't as important to their offenses. But so far, this is really good to see.
Yeah, this has been, if nothing else, if you are looking for any reason to actually watch the Vikings this year, it's clearly between him and Cook. And Cook has also been running really, really well. Do you feel that Cook is playing at the moment as somebody who is earning the contract extension that he just got?
Yeah, kind of. If we excise out the question of whether or not he'll continue this level of play, right? And if we just talk about what he's done over the past 3 or 4 games and how much he's contributed to his own performance versus how much, say, like run blocking has contributed, or how much scheme or design has contributed. Like we saw a lot of motion in this last game, and that's kind of, improved the blocking angles for Cook and has allowed him to be a little bit more effective. If we just kind of get rid of the question about whether or not this will continue, because we actually had the same question last year when he had a strong first 8 games of the season. Yes, he is playing out his contract. So there's a couple of ways you can look at it. The very first way is PFF grade, just because that attempts to do a pretty good job of separating out the impact of run blocking and running. It doesn't do an amazing job. It does a pretty good job, and it does a better job than yards per attempt or yards after contact or anything like that. And Dalvin Cook is one of the top, if not the top. Let me do a quick check. Graded running back over the past 4 weeks. So, that's obviously good to see. But beyond that, if you take a look at this next gen metric, hold on, I'm going to do a really quick confirmation on the Dalvin Cook thing. So he's the top graded runner out of running backs in PFF's grading system. In overall grade, he is ranked third among those with enough qualifying snaps behind Austin Eckler and Darrell Henderson. They obviously care a lot. PFF obviously cares a lot about like pass game production, and both of them are mavens in the passing game, so that's part of it. And his biggest knock is like one fumble. But if you take a look at, I mentioned yards after contact per attempt. If you take a look at that, he's doing really well. He ranks 8th in that among those with enough qualifying attempts with 3.59. And in total yards after contact, he ranks number 1, 269. He ranks number 1 by a substantial margin in first downs gained on the ground. And this is something that I think is really exciting about Cook. So aside from the fact that he's like leading the league in rushing touchdowns and leading the league in like yards per attempt after contact for a certain number of carries and stuff like that, his production has been really consistent. It's not because he ripped off, a 75-yard run in week 1 and a 75-yard run last week, and now his average is really high and his yards per contact is really high. He has a lot of 10-plus yard gains. So he's second in the league right now in 10-plus yard gains with 12, just behind Nick Chubb, who has like very clearly the best offensive line in football. So great hire Kevin Stefanski when they grabbed Bill Callahan. But Dalvin Cook is only, his longest run is 39 yards. And if you like take all of his 15-plus yard runs and just cut them to 15, it's a remarkably great yards per attempt. He's doing a really great job being consistent about his running. So that's part of it. You take a look at next gen stats. They've got a statistic, rush yards over expected. So what that does, and I think this is really exciting in terms of the development of analytics and how to evaluate running backs, is they held a contest called the Big Data Bowl where they invited anybody who could participate, which ended up being hundreds of different teams, to use the next gen chip tracking data to see if you could reliably predict how many yards any particular play was going to get, rushing play. And so you had things like, the directions that players were facing because there's 2 chips in the pad. You had, speed at the time of the snap. You had every piece of data that a chip could possibly provide, things like acceleration, things like direction, etc., for all, 22 players on the field. And so using like blocking angles and speed at the time of snap and the formation setup, down and distance and stuff like that, you can create a remarkably reliable estimation of how many yards on a particular play a player is going to get. And that is kind of independent of the running back. So it's kind of a blind system. So what this does is it allows us to evaluate on that running play, how much did you get, knowing what the blocking looks like at time of handoff. And so it kind of isolates the running back. And so in total rush yards over expected, Dalvin Cook ranks second, just behind Kareem Hunt. In terms of average, Dalvin Cook ranks like 6th. And then among those with like enough qualifying attempts, he ranks 3rd, behind Nick Chubb again and Aaron Jones. So that I think is a really kind of remarkable way to kind of look at that. So in any way that you look at Dalvin Cook's production, I think he's also the top bell cow in elusiveness rating. Like above him are some injury replacements like Mike Davis, Jordan Wilkins, Boston Scott, some split back situations, Kareem Hunt and Devin Singletary, and then Dalvin Cook. He's the only one with over 60 or actually over 50 attempts out of anybody in that group. He leads the league in elusiveness rating with 21 broken tackles in the run game, which is the most of any back, and a high level of yards after contact per attempt. So in these 4 games, Dalvin Cook has been responsible for a lot of his production. We've seen that the run blocking can be very poor at times, especially with Dakota Dozier and Drew Samia, and he's had to do a lot. And I will say this, I think Brown and Neal has improved as a run blocker, and Garrett Bradbury is really coming into his own as a run blocker, and he's actually playing really well. But Cook has made a lot of his own yards, and that is really, exciting to see. I don't think that this is necessarily sustainable, but if it is, and he sustains it over 14 or even 16 games, that is, I think, justification for the contract, because it's good production that he owns, not production that seems to be a product of the environment around him.
So Kirk Cousins got hit a lot on Sunday. It was unfortunate. There were a couple of times where you just wanted to scream, throw the ball away, or move. But much like the person who wouldn't leave the house in the horror movie, There was nothing you could do, and there was certainly nothing that he could do in that situation. This offensive line, when it comes to pass blocking, just has moments of being atrocious. And Drew Samia had another game this weekend.
Yeah. So I'll say this about Samia. He played better this week than last week. I think he still was the lowest graded guard of week 4. So, that's part of it. Oh no, there were some injury replacements that did worse than him. So, congratulations.
Well, then time to pop the champagne bottles then, because that's
yeah, he ranked 68th of the 71 guards. Or I should say 68 of the 69 guards that played at least 40 snaps. Nice. So second to last. Congrats. It's not last.
You can, and as Vikings fans know, you can't really scheme out of this sort of situation. You're kind of stuck at this point. Week 4, you know what your offensive line is.
Yeah, there's not much you can do. Like, you could play Ezra Cleveland. I suspect that there's a reason that they're not, right? Like, I think the same staff that decided that Drew Samia should not, play instead of Pat Elflein, that's the same group that would make the decision between Ezra Cleveland and Drew Samia, right? Like, that's a lot of people wanted Drew Samia to play instead of Elflein because they knew how bad Elflein was, and he's bad. It's not really much getting around that. But Drew Samia is like a whole catastrophic tier worse. He's bad enough that I've had to, when I'm writing my players of the week pieces, I have to just be like, wow, DeForest Buckner had a really great game. Well, I don't know. It's not really fair to put him there.
Right? Within reason. It's we referred to him not as a turnstile before, but as that orange plastic thing in the middle of the road when it goes to 2 lanes that gets knocked down and stays down. Like, he's that version of a defender. It's not
right.
God help Cousins every time he drops back.
Yeah, so it was tough on Cousins. Cousins did not make it particularly easy on himself either. He held onto the ball a lot, and he does this a lot. Like, it's not, I wouldn't say it's like a failing of his. It's a product a little bit of the scheme too. But he had 85% of his dropbacks exceed 2.5 seconds in this game, which was the most of any quarterback in week 4. But you'll notice that there's kind of a trend with some of them: Patrick Mahomes, Carson Wentz, and Daniel Jones. They all play in play action heavy offenses. And this week, the Vikings were a play action heavy team. They played half the dropbacks were play action. And so that tends to lead to holding onto the ball. And he likes kind of confirmation of what he's seeing. He can be an anticipation thrower, but sometimes he's not. And sometimes the plays are a little bit slower developing for one reason or the other. So he invited some of that pressure himself. So I don't want to put it all on the offensive line. Again, Drew Samia is a disaster waiting to happen right now unless he dramatically improves his play in ways that we can't foresee. That's a problem. Not like Dakota Dozier's playing well. Riley Reif, I think, had his first kind of worrisome game of the season, which that by itself is actually kind of good news, right? Like, obviously, if he never had a worrisome game, that's the best news. But the fact that he was noticeable for the first time in terms of his play, that I think is a reminder that he actually has played well the previous 3 weeks. So that's good to see. But, he was not a particular help in this game. Brian O'Neill had, I think, his worst game ever, maybe? I don't know. Like, this is a really bad game for him. If I take a quick look at the PFF grades. So, yeah, worst game of the season. That one's easy because he's actually played pretty well so far. 2019, he had one game that was worse. That was the divisional playoff against San Francisco. 2018, he had 2 games that were worse. Or 3, actually. So, worst game of the year for Brian O'Neill from a PFF standpoint. Certainly the worst I recall him playing in a very long time. I guess I forgot the divisional playoff game, partially because it's a playoff game, so I think of it differently, partially because I think it's better if everyone forgets it. But yeah, he's only officially logged with giving up one hit, but his grade, I think, of 54.5 is a better indication of how he played, because he did, I think, a lot worse than only give up one hit in pass protection. I thought, there's like confusion in assignment delegation that led to some of the Whitney Merciless sacks. I thought, his movement in the run game for the first time this year was a little bit of a problem. And yeah, just generally speaking, Brian O'Neill didn't do as well as he usually does. Riley Reef didn't do as well as he usually does. Drew Samia improved to like no benefit. So, when that's 3 out of your 5 offensive linemen, it's like fairly not great, right? That you end up with like a pretty decent performance from Dakota Dozier for like the first time, right? Like, okay, great, thanks. But everybody else just had issues except for Garrett Bradbury, who again is playing really well. So yeah, Cousins held onto the ball a lot. That led to a lot of pressure. He was the 4th or 5th most pressured passer in the league this week. And Drew Samia was a big part of it, and Brian O'Neill was a big part of it. So kind of mistakes all around in that regard.
So let's talk, and Thielen, just before we switch over to the defense, because there's a lot of questions that we can ask on the defense. Thielen had a pretty productive game as far as his use was concerned. He ended up in the end zone, obviously, but this was a game where it didn't seem like he was having any problems getting open, especially the pass that was tossed to him where no one was around him for 25 yards.
Yeah, and this is like a fairly typical Thielen game from like 2018, right, where he was grabbing a bunch of 100-yard games, and it was easier to notice him because the announcers were like, it's the 6th 100-yard game in a row. That's pretty exciting, and less because he had a giant explosive play. He did have one, I think, it was like 39 yards, but for the most part, 8 catches, only 4 of them were for first downs. Just generally, just like really solid receiving, right? Like 114 yards, kind of like the quiet way. Except that, the touchdown was pretty great. And so just generally speaking, it really does feel like the kind of, I don't want to say supplemental effort, because you can win with it when that's your primary receiver and that's how he wins. But generally just like great, consistent, solid effort that helps you move the chains and keep yourself ahead of the offense. So for the most part, the kind of game that you really wanted to see from Justin Jefferson, so that Adam Thielen could go off on explosive plays, something that he can do really well. He can be kind of like a 4-catch 100-yard guy, or he can be an 8-catch 100-yard guy. It really just depends on what the defense is giving you or what the offensive game plan calls for. But I really would have thought entering the season that it actually would have been reversed, that Adam Thielen would take on the Stephon Diggs role, because again, they have very similar skill sets, and Justin Jefferson would take on the Adam Thielen role. Again, they have very similar skill sets, so anybody could have taken any of those roles. But I think it would have been easier to expect the rookie to take on kind of the role of winning possessions in the slot and stuff like that. So Thielen did a really great job kind of keeping the offense ahead of the chains, even though only 4 of his receptions were for first downs by themselves. He did a really great job, acting as kind of an outlet receiver to Justin Jefferson's kind of explosiveness, and they complemented each other, I think, really well. And adding that touchdown to put the Vikings, I think it was to put the Vikings ahead.
Yes,
was I don't know. It's good to see, because I think one of the issues that we've had, and I don't think anyone is all that concerned about Thielen as a player, but one of the issues we've had is that we just haven't seen that much of him. He got 110 yards against Green Bay that all either occurred in the first quarter on the opening drive, or like the last quarter when Green Bay didn't seem to be as. It's difficult to call it garbage time, because like Green Bay did seem to be trying to stop the Vikings, but they also were like not concerned about like throws over the middle at the same time. But they all came either at the end or the beginning, where it just didn't feel like, he had an impact at high leverage moments in the game. So this is the first game where it felt like, he not only gained a substantial amount of yards, because he gained like 60 total yards over the past 2 weeks before this. He gained a substantial amount of yardage in the game, and it felt like it mattered, right? And so it's been a bit. This is probably not a criticism of Thielen more than it is a criticism of Kirk Cousins and the offensive line and maybe play design. But it was good to see that. And I think having Jefferson there, I think was a big part of it, because now Cousins isn't forced to like go off of Thielen when he sees a safety shaded over, right? Like he can, they can go into cover one instead of cover two, or they can, when they do go into cover one, actually center point the receivers instead of shading over Thielen. Having that threat available opens up other coverage opportunities. So it was really nice to see Thielen have a meaningful impact in a game, because I don't think we've seen that so far.
Well, I mean, you could argue that week one was the only pass play we're going to do is to Thielen. That's all it seemed. Week two, it was Thielen and this. I believe this was the Rudolph game, and the Rudolph back of the end zone, but maybe Rudolph possibly, but still all Thielen. Then last week it was Jefferson and Thielen, and this week it's worked, and it's kind of worked itself out that way. Is it just me, or are we doing a hell of a lot less in the way of screens than we did last year?
Yeah, well, I think part of it's because the screens kind of suck. So, like, the Vikings are like, well, I guess we don't have to do that. But yeah, it does feel like there are fewer screens. I could probably check the data on that real quick if I wanted to.
It seemed like every other play that we were doing last year involved much more play action, or involved some form of screen, or involving CJ Ham in the pass game, which, while I'm a fan of, it infuriated like everyone else who was watching the games. Like, why the hell is our fullback involved in all of these screens, when in reality it seemed like we had so many better options?
All right, well, the data hub that I used to check on screen passes isn't working, so let's just ignore the data and just say, I feel like you're right, James.
I will take that. Let's talk defense for a moment. And the big thing that happened on defense wasn't even really a series of plays. This was Harrison Smith getting ejected for what Vikings fans would argue was just a flag play, a warning play, not an ejection play. So what did the coaches have to say after the game, and was this ejection justified?
So Mike Zimmer said after the game that, he thought that it wasn't a dirty hit, that Harrison Smith led with his shoulder, that Harrison Smith isn't a dirty player, and that this is the kind of play that's just going to happen because, in today's league, he always sometimes, has to make it about that. In today's league, we don't, there are no repercussions for going over the middle for quarterbacks. Like, quarterbacks just have more capability to go over the middle than before. Whereas before, there was more strategy about whether or not you would allow that to happen. And now you can't really do that. You kind of have to let it happen. So that's part of it. But
it was basically the situation of, well, you're going to get your wide receiver killed if you keep putting him in that spot. Like,
right,
that's the way it used to be.
Yeah. And that isn't happening. So he said that. And he pointed out that Smith led with the shoulder, and it was just kind of, the receiver lowers his helmet, and then there's helmet to helmet contact that's not initiated by the defender. There's not much you can do. And he says, flag him, fine. So, he even says, you might flag him even though there's nothing the defender can do, because you have to discourage those kind of hits, and you can't really. And I'm kind of putting words in his mouth as to why it's okay to flag him. But I think the idea is, you need to discourage those hits, and you can't really start penalizing based off of intent for those bang plays. So you kind of have to flag them when they happen. But an ejection, which by NFL rule does not require malicious intent, but an ejection is a bit much. And I agree with that. I think that, not because of Harrison Smith's history, which is as a hard hitter but not a dirty player, and not because of the way defense is called in the NFL these days, and how you need to allow defenses to be more aggressive. Neither of those reasons, but because I genuinely think that there was no lowering of the helmet at a point where the player could have kind of resolved it in the receiver's favor. I think it was kind of it was inevitable, and so because of that, I don't think an ejection was warranted. But either way, it happened. And so the Vikings, who did not have any backup safeties, were forced to put in their backup safety, who practiced in the nickel all week. And so he actually was learning the defense from the perspective of a nickel corner, and not from the perspective of a safety. And I know that there were people that were like pretty critical of Zimmer when that, detail kind of came out. Like, why don't you have a safety who's practice safety? And to that, I say, yes, that is a fair criticism. There's not much to add to that. But I will say that doesn't mean I would blame kind of George Aloka, right? Because they did need a backup nickel. Like, there's no question about that. And you needed to promote somebody who could play backup nickel for you. The fact that it's somebody with an S next to their name instead of a CB next to their name, I think is immaterial. It's the person that you think can best play nickel. They needed a backup nickel. They just also needed a backup safety and like maybe have one less receiver active or something like that. From that perspective, the fact that Aloka had to play safety when he was playing corner, kind of all week in preparation, that kind of sucks. There's maybe some coverage confusion there and so on. He played poorly, right? There's not really much getting around that. But this is more of a planning issue where, Anthony Harrison Smith kind of don't get hurt all that often. But Harrison Smith has been hurt in the past. He's been ejected actually in the past. And Anthony Harris, the only reason you have him is because he got hurt in college, right? And so it's not like they're invincible, right? We've got evidence that they're not. And so you need a backup safety. And if it's not going to be the guy with an S next to his name that you promoted, it should be someone else who's played safety in the system. And you should have to kind of bite the bullet on having to I forget who the other player was that they promoted up from the active squad to be active for this game, but you have to bite the bullet on that other player, I guess, right? Maybe it was Hardy Nickerson. I don't know if he's on the 53 man. But yeah, like having that backup safety is critical. So that out of the way, and they did need the backup nickel, but with that out of the way, I think that more has been blamed on George Aloka than is warranted. For example, Sam Ekstrom tweeted out that, it looked like there was coverage confusion on the Will Fuller reception that was charged to Cameron Dantzler. And this is kind of an effort to say that Dantzler actually played even better than the PFF grade gave him, and he actually gave up less in coverage. But very clearly, the Vikings rotated to cover 3 in response to a motion at the snap. This is because motion is usually a run alert, which means that if they're going to run the ball, you want to have an extra body in the box because the 7 in the box and player in motion across the line of scrimmage, there's an extra gap you have to account for. And so you don't have enough for every gap, so you need another player in the box. And typically, a single high safety is a way to do that. You move your strong safety down so that they can fill a gap and not get the play broken open. But instead of that being a running play, it turns out it's Randall Cobb on a wheel route. And now you're in cover 3, which means that if you've got 2 receivers on the outside, your deep third receiver or cornerback who's Cameron Dantzler has to find a way to negotiate that conflict, and they have to midpoint between the two receivers, which is just a remarkably difficult thing to do. Anthony Harris was late rotating over, something he needs to do when that situation arises in order to kind of alleviate pressure. Aloka plus 4 other players bit really hard on the play action, which helped, I think, create the problem there. But I think that was primarily on Dantzler. So I think there's been a little bit too much criticism of Aloka in that regard. And I want to thank Betts at L22 for helping me kind of resolve what happened on the play. But it was pretty bad. But we have to also remember the corners are young and they're going to make mistakes too. So Harrison Smith leaving, huge impact. Maybe that rotation doesn't even happen with Harrison Smith in there, right? Because you'd be kind of maybe a little bit more hesitant to throw it deep or have a motion or something like that. So who knows? But that's all kind of part of the discussion here.
Yeah, the corners had their lunches eaten in front of them for most of the game. This wasn't a particularly good outing, but anyone who's watched the Vikings this year knows that the corners are young and not very good, quite frankly.
Yeah, and I do think that they're getting better, which is good to see. But yeah, they're just going to make mistakes.
Yeah. So this wasn't a particularly promising performance by the corners. This did have a feel of more of the same, and it's just good that the offensive coordinator for the Texans, whose name escapes me at the moment, didn't find a way to just exploit this further. Like, we're just going to be tossing it 20, 30 yards down the field every play, because what the hell are they going to do to us? Like, how are they? It's not like they're going to be able to stop this.
Right. Yeah. I mean, when you've got like just kind of a mistake-prone defense, I mean, you want to take advantage of it when you're opposing offense.
Yeah. And we were expecting much more in the way of attacking the Vikings via the run and having it be successful. Or, the Vikings have a history of having problems with quarterbacks that can run. And Deshaun Watson is somebody who can run. So let's have him become a statue.
Yeah, that's another element that we should probably put in the what were the coaches doing category. Part of that's on Deshaun Watson for not scrambling, but also part of it is like maybe put in a couple of designed runs. I know your quarterback's getting hit a lot, so you can cool it a little bit, but like the Vikings were just awful at this sort of thing. So do some of it so you can gain some pretty significant yards. The Texans' running game is just not that good. We covered it in the interview. And a lot of that has to do with blocking. So creating unique angles that help the run game, either through motion or quarterback runs, that would be pretty good. And they didn't do that. Deshaun Watson also declined to scramble at key moments when space kind of opened up for him to do that. That's on him, not on the coaching staff. And the Vikings were kind of lucky there. Chad Graff kind of went over that in his, things we learned from the Houston game piece. So that, was kind of fortunate against Russell Wilson. I don't think you're going to have those baffling errors. So that's going to be a question mark going forward, whether or not they can actually deal with quarterbacks who can run, because the evidence suggests that they can this year. And I would say that it is a very light suggestion and probably not going to hold true going forward. I think that's going to be a problem, especially, of course, with the light interior that the Vikings have and the problems they have stopping the run with their defensive tackles, and with Anthony Barr out, and with Eric Wilson, who is really just poor against the run as your primary nickel linebacker. So, or your primary linebacker next to Eric Kendricks. So yeah, all of that is it's kind of baffling why the Texans, didn't use Deshaun Watson that way.
It really, even the announcers, like, what exactly are they doing here? Like, this defense for the Vikings is historically bad against the run this year. Why is Deshaun Watson turning into a statue? Like, at some point it becomes a situation where even though he's playing against the team that you cheer for, like, you want to see him succeed in some way. Like, you want to see like him succeed maybe after this game. Like, hey, maybe he opens back up. We know he's a talented quarterback. He needs, the confidence, or he needs a coach that'll actually say, do this. You have the ability to run. You have the ability to scramble and do something here. This isn't like when we were debating whether or not a player was actually a running back or a tight end or a quarterback. Like, this is a real deal quarterback, and it just sucks to watch him just sign an extension to stay there, because he just did, and deal with this just awful play calling selection, or awful lack of like options for him to be able to do something. But the last thing I want to mention is that he was getting hit, and his pocket was collapsing around him fairly well, even though he had moments where it seemed like he had forever and a day to be able to throw.
Yeah, there were moments where it felt like he was just kind of spending 3 years back there, like writing a novel, and other moments where it felt like the Vikings were doing a pretty good job getting to him. I kind of, I guess it's not really, but I kind of feel bad for Unique Ngakoue, because I think he had a couple of opportunities to turn pressures into sacks that were then graded as runs by NFL statistics. So like there's a scramble up the middle that I think was graded up as a run for -3 yards. There was one where he actually did get past the line of scrimmage, so you have to grade it as a run, but only for like a yard, and Ngakoue got it. So yeah, it would have been nice to have the statistics help Ngakoue in that regard. But as a pass rusher, I thought he did pretty well. He ended up, I want to say, with 5 pressures. I know PFF says 4, but I think he got a quarterback hit in there as well. Maybe I'm counting one of those runs as a pass. Who knows? But then he also got a couple of stops in the running game, which, again, some of that's just kind of taking the quarterback from behind. So it's not like the running game in the same way. But yeah, for the most part, I thought Ngakoue played pretty well. For the second game in a row, Afadio Denebo got 5 pressures. That was nice to see. So the Vikings aren't racking up tons of sacks, right? And one of the sacks was like an unblocked DJ Wanham sack, so he didn't actually get any other pressure for the rest of the game. So there's not really much to go off for him. He only had 11 pass rushing snaps.
I did have a moment when he got that sack of, wait, who the hell got that?
Yeah, right.
Like this is what's his name? Michael Kist, your mortal enemy, who covers the Eagles, had a tweet this weekend. It's like, I've never had a game for the Eagles during the regular season where I had to have the full roster up on a screen just to like verify who was actually doing the thing. I felt like I was having to do that at one point with some of the members of the Vikings. Like, wait, I know you. This is.
I've heard of you.
I've heard of you. Okay. Arif has talked about you before. I just didn't get a number to it, like a name to a face sort of thing. It's like, how the hell? Okay. Hey, you got the sack. I'm not complaining. And you're clearly happy about it. I just thought that was Ngakoue at first.
Right. So yeah, that was his first career sack. Congrats to him. He only had 11 pass rushing snaps, so he didn't really get to see, whether or not he can do anything on a consistent basis. But not a bad way to start. But yeah, there was like pressure from the interior for the first time in a bit. That was nice to see. But yeah, for the most part, the Vikings did a pretty decent job. I'm not going to say a great job, but a pretty decent job crowding the pocket. If I wanted to take a quick look at pressure rate, just to get a good feel on it, 12 of 40. So I guess it wasn't that much. But he did scramble a lot. 30%. That's not bad, but it's just not great. But yeah, compared to how the Vikings have been doing over the past couple of weeks, you love to see it, right? So yeah, there was, I think pressure, especially from the edge. The Vikings, after being so blitz heavy in week 1, have kind of calmed down on that. I thought part of that was because week 1, they're against a quarterback that's known to be worse against the blitz in Aaron Rodgers. And then week 2, they were against a quarterback that was known to be elite against the blitz in Phillip Rivers. And so they were kind of following that. And then kind of from there on out, it's been average to below average blitz rates. Yeah, I was kind of curious about that. I think because the Vikings are attempting to protect those corners, which is why they're in cover 2 a lot this year, as opposed to cover 3 or cover 4, which they've done a lot in the past. They would also kind of blitz a lot to try and vacate some areas of the field to try and ramp up the pressure from a group that's not getting a ton of pressure. But because Denebo's actually performing, pretty well over the past 2 weeks, they may not have to. Hopefully they can go from average to above average, because it's probably not going to be enough defensively unless the Vikings continue to get, 3 100-yard games from their skill players.
So let's put a bow on this on this wrap up. Is there anything else that needs to be said about this game other than this does take away from the narrative of Trevor Lawrence to Minnesota as pick 1?
Yeah, well, yeah. The Trevor Lawrence dream is dying. It's not dead yet. We'll see what the Jets do. It's probably dead, but it's not technically dead. Yeah, so I'm not like a huge fan of tanking. So I'm fine with a win. Yeah, I talked about it a couple episodes ago. It's just like, tanking is right, and any argument you'll have with me, you'll probably win, right? Because like tanking is smart. There's no question about it. But I just kind of love watching teams try to win. So happy that the Vikings won. I like to talk about a team that has playoff potential. Technically, they do. They've got like an 18% chance to make the playoffs if you use historical odds. I think 538 gives them slightly better odds than that. And so, yeah, fighting for like a 1 in 5, 1 in 6 chance for the playoffs. Tenuous, but fun to talk about. So that's the implication of the game. Let's see if they can be competitive against a good team, because they were competitive against the Titans. I guess that's kind of a good team. But they were not competitive against either the Colts or the Packers, who were good teams, even though the score differential in the Packers game was like 9. But, they were not competitive.
I feel like tenuous but fun to talk about might as well just be the slogan about the Minnesota Vikings. Like, yeah. we're just coming up with the full thing there. Before we start on the mailbag, I just want a quick mention that we have a listener who is in the Norse Code, is one of the 4 Norse Code fantasy leagues.
Who are we talking about? Damian Barrett?
We are talking about the Damian Barrett,
the legend,
the myth, the legend, the man, the myth, the legend. He has managed to have 3 kickers in 3 weeks miss extra points. It is amazing to watch, quite frankly. I haven't had the pleasure of beating him as a result of this, but I told him he needs to, if this isn't a record, that we're just going to make it one right now. So since we started to create this record-taking service, or since we started to keep records on such a thing, which we're going to say today, October 6th, 2020, this is the longest streak in the history of the league. It in the regular season, there might have been a 3. I personally might have had a 3 kicker situation. No, I won. Oh, that's what it was. I played against 3 people in a row in the playoffs that got me to the championship game that had misses, and then I didn't win because the guy didn't kick a miss or didn't miss a kick. But yeah, this truly is some rarefied air. And I told him too, it's like, you just need to embrace this, lean into it, just lean into it right now, and just make sure that this is your legacy. Try for 4. At this point, you're probably not going to go far in the playoffs. You might as well just try to embrace it. Also,
see if you can identify the next missed kick, because that's interesting, right? Trying to identify the next missed extra point.
Yeah, I'd be like, okay, well, the Falcons just replaced theirs, and he missed last night too, and so I do enjoy that Luke Braun is just losing his mind watching games now, because anytime a missed extra point happens, he immediately has to load up Yahoo and see who it affected. Like, listen, this has been my life for years. You have only just begun to deal with this. This is my life. This is literally the only type of fantasy football I play, because I have one league outside of Norse Code that I forced them to adopt this rule. And it's this absurd system with like 2 quarterbacks, 4 wide receivers, 2 running back, like just way too many flex players. So scores are always like 250 or so, like 200, 250. And then there's the mixed extra points. Just like, dude, it's beautiful. I want them to have to require 2 kickers next year, but no one seems to want to talk to me when I send messages out to the message board. So I don't know why. I also did this week. After the show, I have to disqualify somebody for starting a kicker for a team that wasn't playing. That hasn't actually happened yet. That is the rule. You have to start an active kicker, and COVID is no excuse. Because they started.
No excuse.
Nope, COVID is no excuse. That's an episode title right there. COVID is no excuse. The kicker for the Titans was started at a time when the Titans had their game moved to the bye week. They still haven't opened up yet. So you got to pay attention to that, even if your opponent decides to play dirty and take the other 2 remaining kickers and roster them so you can't grab them. Which, dirty pool, but Kyle Slaby, I salute you. That was terrible sportsmanship, and I love it. Thank you, sir. I just want to say how proud I am of the terrible thing that you did. All right, let's move over to the mailbag, because there is a story that came out this week that we should cover. Nick asks, I've been hearing rumors the last few days saying that Danielle Hunter has been told to not play this season by a doctor. And then I saw a tweet from him sort of dispelling the rumor. Then I heard he was in New York getting a second opinion. How much truth is there to this? I get that where there is smoke, there has to be fire, as the saying goes. And there also is a Chris Thomason story as well, talking about, was it his personal trainer? Was that?
Yeah, his personal trainer.
Yeah, so what exactly is going on here? Do we know anything? I think is the best answer, or best question.
Right. So it's one, source, right? So you always have to take it with a little bit of a grain of salt. It is a named source, right? So there's some level of accountability that you don't get with multiple anonymous sources, but it's one source. So you have to take that into account. But, Danielle Hunter's trainer says that Hunter was told that he should sit out the season, and that he went to New York specifically to get a second opinion. That second opinion is something that has been confirmed by Mike Zimmer, that he sought a second opinion in New York. But that second opinion, the trainer says he also received the information that he should sit out the season. There's no mention of surgery in the piece, so that's something to keep in mind. But there is a mention of surgery, but no mention that surgery is either necessary or unnecessary, just that we don't know about it. But that, he should be kept out. There's also information that, this is the kind of injury that might, last 3 or 4 months typically, from somebody who's not familiar with the specifics of Danielle Hunter's case. So that is the scuttlebutt, right? So it's more than a rumor, but less than a confirmed story, if that makes sense. There's, I think, teeth to it, right? Because somebody who would be in the know would have some level of information, and they've reported it.
All right, next question is is from John Belk, who asks, what are the areas where Jefferson has been better than his pre-draft projection, and how sustainable has that looked? Basically, what are the realistic, optimistic, and best case projections for him now? You had just put out your piece, so I don't need you to rehash the entirety of your piece, but maybe let's just focus on the beginning about where he's been better than his pre-draft projection.
Yeah, so the parts of the pre-draft projection that he's, I think, improved on from like an individual trait standpoint, I think his release off the line of scrimmage really stands out. So he played outside a bunch his sophomore year and the slot a bunch his junior year right before he got drafted. So his final year in college, we've talked about that kind of ad nauseum on this podcast. But one of the concerns that comes out of that is, does he have the ability to win against press coverage, essentially. And, it's not that it's impossible to have press coverage in the slot. You're just not likely to see it because it is so easy for slot corners to take advantage of all of the additional space there. I mean, you can just punish press coverage really easily, but, there are occasions coming out of like a nasty split where he's lined up very close to the line of scrimmage where you'll see some contact from a cornerback and so on. But for the most part, you didn't get to see his release. And then in his sophomore year, he did not have great releases off the line of scrimmage. Now, mind you, he had like 100 plus catches his sophomore year, right? So it's not as if, he was struggling or anything like that, but that was an area of his game that you might be concerned didn't translate into the NFL. Now, he so far has done a really good job with his releases. They seem to be, and I go into this in a lot more detail in the piece, they seem to be of a particular style. So hopefully he's got, additional kind of release moves on the docket. Otherwise, he's going to get kind of exploited pretty soon. But he's played a large portion of his snaps on the outside. Some of that is because the Vikings are moving back from all the 11 that they played in the first couple of weeks to 2 receiver sets. But he is playing a lot more out wide than in the slot. And so that suggests that the Vikings were pretty confident in that capability of his. So that's one area. I think his catch point capability, that was always a plus for him. But I think he's outplaying that. Like, I think he's playing even better than the positive projection of his ability to win at the catch point. So that's really nice to see. And then one thing I noticed looking at the All-22 is that he is an insanely like precise route runner when he needs to be. Like, I think everyone always kind of figured he's a good route runner, especially because like, why is he getting drafted in the first round if he's not a contested catch guy or a speed guy, right? Why is he a good route runner, or why is he getting drafted? It's because he's a good route runner. But this is not necessarily an element of absolutely good route running. There's a lot of good route runners that don't do this, but it is really interesting to notice his like cuts, like his 90-degree turns are like sharper than any other receiver at full speed that I think I've seen. And so if the route asks him to cut on the 30-yard line, he's going to run full speed at the 30, take 1 or 2 steps to slow down, and then burst out running, almost full speed coming out of it right directly along the 30-yard line. Like, it is really interesting to see. And I didn't really expect that because he kind of struck me as, because he's so fluid, he struck me as a player that might play around at the stem a little bit more, and so you're not always going to be precise coming out of the route. But that's something that he's doing a lot too. And because of that, it's really difficult to get a jump on his routes. The reason that they don't want you to round out your routes is because you're signaling to the cornerback where you're going. And because you're turning and they don't have to turn, they're going to get there faster than you and they might get a pick. So that's why rounding out your routes isn't very good. He's doing like the exact opposite of that. And that's pretty fascinating. So those are two areas where I would say, or I guess three areas where I would say he is outperforming what was written on his draft report.
Ben asks, have you noticed anything specific in how much better Bradbury has been this year?
Specifics, I mean, he's been he's provided, I think, a more solid foundation against bull rushes. I think his base is a little bit more balanced. I think he's done a better job keeping players out of his chest. And so one of the issues that centers have specifically, and Garrett Bradbury had kind of, is that because you've only got one hand available to you off the snap because the other one is snapping the ball, you have to get your hand up right away. And it's very easy to be lazy about that. Lazy is the wrong word. It's very easy to have difficulty paying attention to how you do it, I should say, because everything happens instantly that close at the line of scrimmage on the interior. And so your first priority is just get your other hand in position. And very often you won't swing you'll swing your elbow out because that's what your body naturally wants to do. You won't snap it in as you bring it up. So you snap the ball, bring your hand up. More likely than not, your elbow is going to flare out. The importance of that is that it provides power when your elbow is in and you push forward. So he's doing a pretty good job of that. I think a better job than last year. He's doing a pretty good job just, making sure that he's set off the line of scrimmage so he can do that. It also lets him deal with finesse moves a little bit more, which he's had a little bit of trouble with as well, not just the power moves. But for the most part, I think that the thing that he's really exciting is the thing that we always know he was good at, which is his, blocking on the run. It's something he did well at NC State. It's something he did well at moments with the Vikings last year, but it's been more consistent this year where when he's on screen passes or when, he's blocking at the second level, he just does a really great job. And he had issues finding aiming points. So that part is more consistent. But he's getting to his landmarks and he's doing it really fast. And so that's helping create lanes in the run game. So hopefully those are some specifics about kind of what he's doing that kind of help answer that question.
The Professor Poop asks, all in all, a good game. I even got some excellent samples of poopiness in the last few defensive drives. Now that we are clearly too good for the tank for Trevor/Fields, what position in the draft should we be looking at? Offensive tackle, guard, D-tackle, safety, QB of the future, second tier guys? What do you think?
Man, so this is tough because I think that instinctively you take a look at where the Vikings are weakest and you say you want a defensive tackle or you want a guard, right? And I think most people would say guard, but I don't think anyone would complain that much.
Most people have been saying guard for 10 years at least.
Yeah, right. That's part of it too, is that, it's been a bit. There's some slight relief with Joe Berger and that's about it. But it's been a bit. And so, those are probably the two positions, right, that people would prioritize, but they're also less valuable. And so the meme would be if they grabbed a corner, right? That would be crazy funny to me, worth criticizing, but also crazy funny.
Yes.
But there's a logic to it, right? What if Mike Hughes just doesn't have it, right? It's his third year. Kind of.
It's the question, what do you get the team that needs everything?
Right. And so cornerback just kind of matters more. Okay, you've got Cameron Dantzler, you got Jeff Gladney and Holton Hill. Odds are one of the two between Dantzler and Gladney is not going to work out right now. It looks like it's probably not Gladney. Hey, maybe both work out and you're fine, but you need some depth, right? So you could go corner. That, I guess, might make sense. You could go edge rusher. Well, actually, you can't because you got Ngakoue now. I totally forgot about that. But I think you might go tackle, which is frustrating because I remember for years people would draft a tackle for the Vikings and I would say, hey, they don't need a tackle. They've got blank, it's Matt Khalil. You don't need a tackle for Matt Khalil. But he's in his third year, right? So they're not going to replace him. They're going to get into the fourth year than the fifth year option for some reason. But yeah, you don't need a tackle. You
That's what they
X, Y, or
do.
Z. It's what they do, right? And they're like, well, I just wanted an offensive lineman. They'll figure it out. And that's what the Vikings did this year, and they did not, in fact, figure it out. But I would not be surprised if they got a tackle because Ezra Cleveland doesn't necessarily have it. It's like a yes or no. And if you don't know and you still need multiple offensive line positions, you might as well grab a tackle and hope that one of the two of them can play guard. Maybe get a guy that is versatile and can maybe do both or either. And then you'll have resolved your long-term issues with Riley Reeves' contract by drafting a tackle. And then the other one is playing guard, a thing that Ezra Cleveland apparently can do, something I would not have anticipated. And I guess like so far, the evidence suggests that he can't. But yeah, I think it's going to be a tackle. I don't love it. I think they should like get a guard. And I don't mean like they should get a guy who played guard in college. Like you can draft a guy who plays tackle and move him to guard if that's his best NFL projection, right? But it should be somebody who projects specifically to guard if you're going to do that. So yeah, I don't know. My mind will probably change like over the course of the season about who it's going to be and how positional value plays a role in it. Maybe I think they should just trade down, right? Like who knows? But they need multiple things. They don't have a second round pick, and that combination of facts is difficult to navigate, especially when you don't necessarily know if the thing they need is all that valuable to get.
That thing, obviously, being the quarterback for NDSU. Billy LG asks, are we seeing any Dom Capers' influence on scheme through 4 games yet? I recall seeing Ngakoue standing upright on a few snaps versus the Colts, but also may have just been a stance preference. If not, is it due to personnel issues like Barr being out in the young corners?
Yeah. That's interesting. I think that I don't think that the Ngakoue stuff is a product of Capers, although, maybe he's a voice in the room, right? That's like, hey, why don't we try doing what he was good at, right? Like, he did a lot of standing up for the Jaguars. I actually am a little bit surprised by that just because he also was actually a fairly effective rusher when he had his hand in the dirt. So I'm kind of surprised that it's like a given, right? That he's better standing up, but like, whatever, that's not that important because it's not as if he's threatening to drop back in coverage, right? So it's not, he's a linebacker in that sense. So that's something to think about. But the Dom Capers stuff, I think we're seeing it. So like, that was my initial reaction when the Vikings blitzed so much week 1, something that they just don't do. I was like, hey, maybe Dom Capers plays a role in this, but I didn't want to say anything because I wanted to see it play out. And then they didn't blitz that much against the Colts. I think that what we're seeing are more tailored game plans to quarterbacks than we're used to seeing. And they've always done it. They've always done a pretty good job tailoring game plans to quarterbacks, which is why, Zimmer has traditionally been very good against Aaron Rodgers, although the numbers are not going to look so good now going forward. I think that because you've got, somebody else in the room that's really good at designing pressure packages and stuff like that, you've got a little bit more latitude to do that. And so that's kind of the influence. And that's like a very difficult influence to quantify or point to and say, hey, this means that. They do have a different defensive staff outside of Capers too, right? They've got like Toronto Jones, for example. So yeah, that's kind of what I'm feeling. I think 4 weeks may not be enough. I kind of want to take a look at who's blitzing and the blitz rates to see if there's kind of more Capers business going on than we're used to seeing. But the Vikings always design interesting blitz packages, even if they don't blitz all that much. So that's something to keep in mind.
Next question is going to be from Anton, who asks, can the reduced amount of relationship questions mean you guys have healed your listeners' partnerships, or are we just too preoccupied with celebrating wins? No, I you know what? A good win can get you through a lot. So maybe that's why we actually hadn't received any questions this week about relationships. So it's entirely possible, Anton. That's exactly what's going on. Mark Ward asks, as a foreigner being subjected to the news of the election cycle, how were you guys trusted to drink alcohol at games/tailgates? Do you not get crowd troubles between rival fans? Now, this is an interesting question because tailgating violence tends to just kind of flare up by year. It's not like a constant thing. It really just tends to kind of flare up especially in the social media age where it just ends up getting recorded. But this year in particular, I wouldn't expect a lot of tailgating, seeing as how you can't actually get into most of these stadiums.
Yeah, so there are actually just not that many fans outside a lot of these stadiums. So that's part of it. And it's different for each state, which makes this kind of like frustrating. But it is like, it has reduced fan interaction. For the most part, fan interaction seems fine. So it's not as if like there was a lot of violence beforehand or anything like that.
But there have been,
I guess I don't know what the baseline standard for a lot of violence is, right? Compared to a non-American.
There's been a couple of years in particular. I mean, in 2016, 2011, people were dying at like before games or after games.
Is it the Raiders 49ers game? Someone got stabbed. Right?
There were a couple of things that would like there were a couple events happening at those specific games out on the West Coast, like at that wouldn't have been Candlestick. I think that would have been the newest stadium. But anyway. It would have been at like the San Fran games where there's a lot of heated confrontations, and anyone who is a visiting fan who goes to an Eagles game has had all sorts of horror stories about the dumb stuff they end up going through, playoff or not. So there are environments that may be a little bit more hostile than others. My problem with answering a question like this is I'm 6'5" and over 300 pounds, and when I go to an away game, I might get a nice like, hey, you're wearing the wrong jersey, but no one ever talks to me in a way or like throws a battery at me because they look at me and think I won't just hit them, I will hurt them. So like I'm a bad person to ask on visiting because I've visited a couple of stadiums. I've been an away fan a couple of games. I didn't have any sort of problems in Seattle. They were very nice. They laughed uncontrollably when I was screaming about how Laquan Treadwell just scored his first touchdown. You people don't understand the greatness that you are witnessing right now. But like at the Jets game, I didn't get anything. Although the Jets game is probably a poor example because there were at one point much more in the way of Vikings jerseys than there were Jets jerseys. But like it's not as prevalent as one would imagine. It's not like the wonderful history of violence that UK soccer matchups just tend to bring out in people, where you have separate entrances for fans and all of that. And so it's not
rampant hooliganism.
As much rampant hooliganism unless you're like in Philadelphia or San Francisco. So also from Mark Ward, current favorite podcasts.
Man, I actually don't listen to that many podcasts anymore. I just don't. Because I'm not like driving to the facility and stuff like that. There's not a lot of time for me to listen to podcasts. I'm not traveling to games. So it's typically when I listen to podcasts. So football related podcasts that I found myself listening to over the past, I want to say 2 years. I need to expand it because I don't have that to draw on. Are The Athletic has a new podcast with Robert Mays and Nate Tice, who he's related to Mike Tice, and I think he's Mike Tice's son. Don't quote me on that, but I think he is. And he's worked for a number of NFL teams. They had a phenomenal follow on Twitter. They do a great football podcast. I think it's just called the Football Podcast, which like it's so uncreative that I think it's creative, that kind of thing. But that's really good. They record like right after all the games on Sunday and recap the week. It's really excellent. And they give like great coaching insights and scheme insights that you typically wouldn't get elsewhere. And they've actually, without knowing it, have helped me write some of my Players of the Week pieces. So that's really great. I like both PFF podcasts. Obviously, if you don't kind of like how snarky, George and Eric get about analytics, first, what are you doing listening to this podcast? Second, I understand that, honestly. I think it's kind of like an acquired taste for football nerds, but it's pretty good in terms of the information it provides. And then the PFF podcast with Sam and Steve, that's pretty good. And then outside of that, I'll just listen to the various podcasts that The Athletic produces. This isn't a plug. They just have really good podcasts for team info when I'm learning. And then Dane Brugler's podcast on rookies. And then outside of the Athletic Network, Fran Duffy has a draft podcast that's really good to listen to. I wish I could remember the name of it. But I'll put that in the show notes. And outside of football, I love Roman Mars's 99% Invisible. Really incredible podcast about design. Sounds boring, isn't. Luke Inman, I subjected him to it when we were driving back from Kansas City, and he's like, a design podcast, whatever, dude. And he listened to it. He's like, wow, that was really good. I did not know that much about cement.
I imagine he just looked at it and went, of course this is something you would be into. Why wouldn't it be something you'd be into? Yeah, yeah. I wonder why.
And then, a podcast you might be into is actually related to 99% Invisible, 20,000 Hertz. It's about
We have talked about that. I think we talked about that in Seattle at one point.
Okay, yeah. That is a phenomenal podcast.
Yep, we definitely talked about that one. I still occasionally listen to the WTF with Mark Maron. As if they have a particularly good guest or something, I'll check that out. There's a podcast I don't know if they're still putting out new episodes for, but they have a great backlog called The Hilarious World of Depression that I really enjoy. That people were talking about kind of the things that they've kind of gone through, and you'll have interviews with people like Mike Birbiglia, for example, or like Dave Holmes and a few like others that like, okay, this is something kind of interesting. This is like how they were kind of dealing with it. So Mara Wilson had a really interesting one, the child actress. Bet. Yeah, that was really interesting. I enjoyed that. There was also what was it? I believe I probably recommended The Bugle the last time that this came up. This used to be John Oliver's podcast before he got too busy with HBO. So, but the backlog of the Bugle episodes, including John Oliver, are just fantastic. There is Lewis Black has started releasing his his after show stuff that he does that he used to do on like Facebook or whatever on social media. He started releasing those as a podcast, and some of them are really good. I can tell you personally, as I was at the one for Fargo, it sucked. Don't listen to the Fargo one. It just was the guy sitting next to me in the front row just talking to Lewis Black, and Lewis didn't have a way to shut him up. It was really, really annoying. It would have been interesting if not for the fact that the guy sitting next to me was a total ass, which is also my humble brag of weighing. I got to the front row of blah, but How Neil Feel is also really good. Neil Brennan, who helped create Chappelle's Show, has a podcast that's also really interesting. So I enjoy that. That's much more topical as far as like the daily stuff. There was one other one. Podcast 99, which goes over every single artist that performed at Woodstock 99 and like goes like a deep dive and talks to survivors and like gets like relics of from items. And it seems like a super like niche thing, but if you were a teenager in around 1999 and would have wanted to go to said thing, this is about as close to like as like possibly in depth as humanly possible. And there's a lot of interesting things that are talked about from both the survivors, the media members who were there, and then just going over the individual acts and their performances. So it's fun to watch, because it's fun to listen to rather, because you start off on the Friday of the festival, and you can feel the mood changing as it goes into Saturday, into the later Saturday, and then as it moves into Sunday when like fires are starting and everything is completely broken down and all of that. So I enjoyed that personally anyway. Don from Ohio says, say at the end of the year that the Texans have a fire sale and everything is on the block for trade, including Watson, to get back draft picks and open up cap space. Would you be willing to trade Watson for Cousins? Hypothetical 3-team trade where the Texans get draft picks out of it.
Okay. I'm going to look at the question specifically in our show notes that James always puts together. I don't do any work for the shows. Watson, that would be so wild. To get back draft picks, open up cap space, would you be willing to trade for Watson for Cousins? So it's just straight up, but there's a third team that gets draft picks.
Likely a third team would end up getting it. It turns into one of the NFL trade or one of the NBA trades.
Right, the NBA trades. Yeah. Which the NFL did shut down a 3-team trade earlier, right? Like it was very weird that they didn't allow it to happen. But or they shut down a sign and trade, I think. Would you be willing to trade like straight up? Like definitely not close. What would you give up? I would give up a first round pick and Cousins. Like I don't like. There's not. Watson is a really phenomenal quarterback who's having a pretty bad year, but a lot of it has to do with I think the coaching and I think some of the stuff around him.
Well, I mean, the fact that they took away nearly his entire supporting cast over the last 2 years has a big thing that has a big deal to do with it.
I think Watson would know how to use Adam Thielen, which actually, honestly, Kirk Cousins knows how to use Adam Thielen. That's not the issue. But I like Will Fuller is like a nice toy, right? Like, and we talked about this in the interview last week, right? These are all like nice receivers to have, right? Brandon Cooks is good to have. Kenny Stills is good to have. But Thielen and apparently Jefferson are receivers that you can go to. Like Watson did not have a receiver to go to after they traded away DeAndre Hopkins. So that's part of it. The offensive line issue, obviously he would still have that with the Vikings, but I think the Vikings do a better job of designing their way around it than Bill O'Brien does. So and Watson does a better job getting out of it, right? Like he creates plays in a way that I think reminds people of kind of when we liked Keenum and not when we disliked Keenum, right? So I would do it in a heartbeat with a 1. Like I would get rid of the 1 as well. So yeah,
that would be interesting to see Deshaun Watson as a Viking with Dalvin Cook, running full blast. You have Thielen, you have Jefferson, you have some different offensive ideas. You maybe have a little bit more stability and maybe a GM who's not a complete idiot that's going to send every possible option for you to use away. Like that would be interesting. Kyle Slaby asks, Gladney had a good PFF grade despite the long pass to Fuller. Was he consistently winning reps and got unlucky, or was this a miss from PFF?
So typically the initial round of grades, you might see that kind of miss. Upon review, they typically, and at this point we're at the upon review stage. Upon review, they're typically pretty good. I did notice like they assigned a sack to somebody. I was doing Players of the Week stuff, and they assigned a sack to somebody, and I didn't think that was fair, so I contacted them and they fixed it. So there's still moments where they don't seem to be necessarily perfect. But if you take a look at like how Gladney did, so his PFF grade is like fine. It's not great. It's a 69.9, which nice. But, or I guess it's a 70.0 if you take a look at it from the game, but the coverage grade is a 69.9. Gave up 67 yards in coverage, which doesn't sound all that great, but the pass breakup, which was impressive, played a pretty big role, I think, in the grade. The fact that he got, two of the receptions that he allowed were offensive losses because of his tackles that were stops. That's a part of it, that he did a pretty good job there. So he gave up a 43-yarder, which is not great. But actually, I remember thinking this while I was watching the game that I wanted to say this for the podcast. So actually, this is the perfect time to do it. We're, I think, really used to the Vikings cornerbacks. When they have a good day, they don't allow anything, right? Like Xavier Rhodes goes up against Odell Beckham and he gets 30 yards. Like that's what we're used to, right? And so when you've got a good day for a cornerback, we're very used to just complete shutdowns, like what Jair Alexander did to whoever the Packers played. Good Lord, I'm like brain is fried from writing these pieces. But Atlanta. What Jair Alexander did to Calvin Ridley. Ridley 0 targets or 4 targets, 0 receptions. Right. That's kind of what we're used to when we're talking about good cornerback play. And so either, we get that and then we get to contrast that with like, when Trey Waynes was bad and he gives up 100 yards, or an average play with a highlight attached to it. But you like good cornerbacks, like good ones, not great ones, but good ones will like give up like a 40-yarder sometimes, right? They'll give up a big play and they'll have had a good day, right? Like I've gotten to the point when I'm writing these players of the week where if a corner gives up a big play, I'm going to double check it because that might not be enough, right? For me to say, you know what, that's not good enough. You can't be a player of the week if you give up a big play. That'll happen. So I think fans have to readjust to the fact that if they see a big play given, and I remember I was tweeting right before he gave up a big play, actually, that Jeff Gladney's actually had a really good day today. And then he gave up a 43-yarder, and I was like, well, all right. I have a gift when it comes to that kind of tweet, I guess. But yeah, we just kind of have to get used to the fact that you can be a good cornerback and then suddenly you'll give up a big play. And that doesn't take away from the fact that you were a pretty good cornerback. He gave up 2 first downs all day. Like that's pretty good. And like one of them was the 43-yarder. So yeah, he had a good day. It wasn't like great, obviously, but he had a good day. I don't think PFF got it wrong.
Final question from Kyle Slaby. He says, I heard it's a celebratory week for the generally useful human. How are you planning on celebrating Arif Week? A cake with 12 candles? Are you letting your friend and mentor, let's be honest, Russ, cook your meals? Ripping your shirt off before joining the conference call with Pete Carroll? So, Arif, what can people do now that it is, quote-unquote, Arif Week with the matchup with the Seahawks coming up this weekend?
All right, so Arif Week was invented like 2 years ago, maybe 3 years ago. I know the Vikings always play the Seahawks, so it's kind of surprising how recent this invention was. But yes. They just decided that there was just going to be a week where they'll concentrate their harassment of me. And at one point, one member of Seahawks Twitter, probably the one that I think his name is Ben, that was like the most enthusiastic about photoshopping me into stuff, felt kind of bad. And he's like, well, we should all come together and like, we're all pretty ardent about this. We can direct this energy in a pretty positive way. Why don't we just like figure out a charity to donate to? And I was like, well, I like that idea. So let's figure it out. And I decided that I wanted to, direct it towards a small nonprofit that I thought, based off of my research, which, like it wasn't like, intense research, but like it's Arif research, right? So I pulled the IRS records, right? So like I looked into it, and I thought that they were doing a pretty good job with the limited amount of funding that they had for a cause that's really important to me. So it's the Lavender Rights Project, which services queer youth, so that's trans, non-binary, non-gender conforming, gay, bisexual, lesbian, and not just youth, but there's a focus on youth that provides them with skills development training. It provides them with legal education and know your rights campaigns to help protect one of the most, in my opinion, unprotected groups in the United States. And so this is an issue that's important to me because I've got a lot of friends who identify as trans or non-binary or queer in some way. And so I know how much good Out Front Minnesota has done on that regard in Minnesota. And I was trying to find an equivalent in Washington, and I couldn't find one based on my cursory research that was big as Out Front. So I wanted to find something that could do a lot with some donations. So you can donate. Obviously, I'll link in the show notes, but it's arifsfundraiser.fundraise.org. They actually set up the landing site for it. So it's fundraise without a D, arifsfundraiser.fundraise.org. And it directs all the donations. So it's a specific landing page for this, but it directs all the donations to the Lavender Rights Project. And you can check out, their website, which I'll also link in the show notes, to the kind of work that they do. They're obviously pretty active this last summer, working in Washington State to kind of address kind of the cross pressures that come with a civil rights movement kind of breaking out over the summer. And so they did a lot of work with people of color as well, and specifically how they deal with the trans community. So if that's something that you think is a cause that, is kind of worth helping out, head over to that website and make Arif Week pretty incredible. So last year we raised a little bit over $1,000. This year we're as we're recording, we're hitting about 24 hours since I tweeted the original link. We're hitting about $2,300 with 49 donors. So that's really incredible stuff. I've gotten a bunch of emails from them back that are like, wow. This guy, actually, I already started crying when I read one of the emails. So it's really cool. We're having a big impact. So if you want to do that, head over there. Again, the link will be in the show notes.
All right, that is going to be it for this episode of Norse Code. We hope you enjoyed it. We will be back later this week to preview the aforementioned Seahawks game and all of the fun hullabaloo that comes from it in a mailbag that I'm sure will be full of people who are as nice to Arif as humanly possible about his possible dual identities and dual fan, fanhoods. Let's go with that. So, Arif, where can they find your recent article on Justin Jefferson?
Yes, you can find that over at The Athletic, theathletic.com/author/Arif-Hassan. I guess it's no longer my pinned tweet. I'm talking about Players of the Week. But it's one of the top Vikings articles. When you head over to the Vikings section of The Athletic, it's going to be on the front page there. You can find that on Justin Jefferson. You can also find Chad's piece that I talked about, the things that you learned from the Houston game, as well as around the NFL stuff that I just talked about.
All right, so that is going to be it for this episode of Norse Code. Again, we hope you enjoyed it. We'll be back later this week to discuss the Seahawks game. So for Arif, my name is James. Thank you guys so much for listening. And please remember to always bring your wine towel. And we will be back later this week. Norse Code is the largest and only division of Norse Code LLC. You can find Norse Code on the Daily Norseman, SB Nation's official Vikings blog, at dailynorseman.com. You can also find it on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Stitcher, or wherever fine podcasts are aggregated. Our Vikings blogger extraordinaire and generally useful human is Arif Hassan, and he can be found on Twitter at Arif Hassan NFL. You can also find his written work at theathletic.com. I am your podcast host and producer, and my name is James Pagashnik. You can find me at the show's official Twitter feed at NorseCodeDN or my personal account at Big Mono. If you'd like to donate a few bucks to the show, you can make your one-time donation at paypal.me/NorseCode, or you can make a recurring monthly contribution by visiting patreon.com/NorseCode. A donation of $3.50 per month does get you bonus material from the show and much more. Any questions or comments that won't fit in a tweet can be sent to norsecodepodcast@gmail.com. On behalf of the Norse Code staff, we thank you so much for listening.
Our formula is this. We go out, we hit people in the mouth.